Thanks so much to Peg for including me. Thank you all for coming. And thanks to the other 5 readers. It's 5 really hard acts to follow. Going last is tough. It was wonderful. So I'm going to read from, I've got this new collection of short stories that came out about a month ago. I'm going to read from the very last story in the book. It's a really long story, so I'm just going to read the first few pages of it. The story is called A Warm Breath. In the months after my friend R's death, I suffered bouts of shame deeper than any I'd experienced before. These were often followed by unreasonable fits of anger, which had me shaking my fist at drivers when I was walking and shouting at pedestrians when I was driving. At least I considered them unreasonable at the time, which is why I didn't tell anyone about them. Now I might accept all this as ordinary, a natural part of the grieving process, as inevitable as my eventual recovery. While I was in the middle of it, though, I didn't know recovery was possible. I believed with near certainty that I was slowly and quietly losing my mind. I went through the motions of job and domestic life, teaching my classes, meeting with students and colleagues, preparing dinner with my wife, changing and bathing and playing with our infant daughter. But secretly, I was saying goodbye to all of them, imagining I wouldn't or couldn't be among them much longer. It both amazed and infuriated me that no one seemed to recognize how close I was to taking leave of my senses, how deeply I retreated into sorrow, though preventing such recognition was exactly what I had intended. My daughter was just shy of 6 months old when R died, and that may account in part for the intensity of my shame. For me to be immersed in the newness of her life when ours was ending seemed not only unjust, but incredibly selfish. I didn't deserve to delight in her smiles, to cheer her first efforts at sitting up on her own, to celebrate her reaching the half-year mark 2 days before R should have turned 38. I did those things anyway, in a distracted fog, all the while feeling I should have been actively mourning the loss of my friend, sitting in a darkened room in uncomfortable clothes, shutting out the world with all its potential for pleasure and contentment. At the same time, I berated myself for not being more present in the here and now, for not taking note of every one of my daughter's chortles and gassy grimaces, for not snapping pictures of her in every new outfit, for not writing down the exact time and date of her first bite of solid food, for not acknowledging how precious each moment was, how quickly everything would change. I was caught, in other words, between living and not living, a condition that wasn't entirely unfamiliar to me, but one that caused me terrible anguish and kept me from losing myself in daily routines. It was in this state, oscillating between wonder and despair, that I stepped out my front door one early morning in mid-March, less than 3 months after R died. 2 years earlier, when we first decided to have a child, my wife and I had moved to Salem, Oregon, to be closer to our jobs. And now I walked its streets at odd hours, 5:30 on a Sunday morning, a quarter to midnight on a Tuesday, glimpsing its features through the dim filter of dawn or dusk, and seeing in its shadings hints of all the places I've been before. What should have been a simple sidewalk in Salem became sidewalks in Morristown, New Jersey, in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, in Edinburgh, in Prague, and even in places I'd read about but had never visited. St. Petersburg, for example, where I've been transported in the works of some of my favorite writers, Babel, Chekhov, Turgenev. I don't know what I was looking for in these places, a suggestion of solid ground maybe, or a map with which to trace my trajectory from the person I'd been to the person I'd become, one for whom loss had seemed inconceivable to one who now saw loss looming wherever he turned. I always had my daughter with me on these odd-houred walks, in a front-loading baby carrier that kept her snugged up against my chest, her arms tucked around my sides, legs dangling. She loved being carried that way, secure up top, feet free to kick as they pleased, and she let out a little squeal of pleasure whenever I buckled the carrier around my waist. At the time, it was the only thing that kept her from fussing. She was active and curious and frustrated by her limitations, especially physical ones. After a few seconds with a toy she couldn't grab and lift to her mouth, she'd start barking at it, barking out odd disgruntled shouts whose inflections reminded me of an angry Russian cab driver with whom I'd once argued for more than 20 minutes on a street corner in Soho. This was years ago, maybe even a decade, but I'd never forgotten the sound of the little man's voice, the exasperated way he coughed out words, switching between English and Russian, making hand gestures that were sometimes threatening, sometimes full of self-pity. He'd driven me from Penn Station to visit a friend whose office was above a boutique on Green Street, and the dispute arose over a luggage surcharge he tacked onto my fare. I didn't have anything that could rightly be called luggage, just an overnight bag into which I'd stuffed a change of underwear and a fresh t-shirt, a toothbrush and a stick of deodorant, a book to read while nursing a hangover on the train ride the next morning. I'd been at my parents' house for a week by then, driven half mad with boredom in the North Jersey suburbs, desperate for a night out with my friend, who lived, I thought, a far more exciting life than I did, commuting on the subway every day from Brooklyn, working as an illustrator for an art book publisher, surveying all the bars in the city for the best selection of Belgian beers. By the time I made it to Penn Station, I was in a state close to euphoria, my imagination rich with the untold promises of the night ahead. And because I was distracted and had my guard down, I made the mistake of letting the stout Russian driver take my bag, a limp duffel, not even a third full, and toss it into the cab's trunk. And how enraged he was that I refused to pay the surcharge, which bumped what should have been a $10 fare closer to $15. Part of my refusal had to do with how little cash I had for the evening and how many Belgian beers I wanted to sample, though there was also the principle of the matter, the fact that no one in his right mind would have called it my overnight bag luggage. If I hadn't been so excited when I got out of the train, I would have just kept the bag on the seat beside me and not let the driver bother popping the trunk. As it was, he wouldn't pop it again to let me get the bag out until I paid the full fare. But after a week back in New Jersey, I was feeling particularly obstinate and unusually willing to be the object of someone else's anger. And I just stood there on the corner of Green and Prince with my hands in my pockets, shrugging whenever I understood what the driver was saying. "You can keep the fucking bag," I said, playing up the New Jersey accent I'd long since excised from my ordinary speech. "I'm not paying the surcharge." After a while, the driver's anger wavered, taking a turn toward resignation, and swelling with pride, with the vicious power of victory, I gave him a nasty half smile, held up a $10 bill, and said, "You want this or not?" And then there was only sadness in his face. He was shorter than me by 2 or 3 inches, his shoulders rounded and hunched forward, his hair wispy. His eyes were small and deep-set, his nose a misshapen blotch, his lips loose like a dog's. There was something tragic about his expression, something that suggested a long history of degradation and struggle, my refusal to pay the surcharge, one in a long line of crushing setbacks. He reached into the cab, popped the trunk, and with his head lowered, put out his hand. He'd wasted 20 minutes arguing with me, when he should have been out looking for more fares. I could imagine the look on his wife's face when he set out the day's earnings on their meager apartment's kitchen counter. "No surcharge?" she'd ask, a frail, bony woman with hollow cheeks and a wheeze in her breath, and he'd shake his head and turn away to hide his tears. I handed him the 10, and for his time and trouble, added a $5 tip. Only later, when I was sampling Belgian beers in an East Village bar that looked like all the other bars my friend brought me to, narrow and dank with no place to sit and a crowd we had to push through to get our drinks, did I learn that New York cab drivers weren't allowed to charge for